The Emperor's Obsession. Once upon a time, there was an emperor who was utterly obsessed with his appearance. He spent countless hours in front of the mirror, admiring his clothes. To him, nothing mattered more than the latest fashion. His wardrobe was the talk of the town, and he would go to any length to showcase his newest outfits. His obsession with clothes was so intense that it made him seem foolish to many, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to be seen in the finest garments. One day, two cunning swindlers arrived in the capital city. They claimed to be weavers of extraordinary skill. They promised to create clothes of unparalleled beauty. The swindlers made a bold claim. Their clothes were so remarkable that they could only be seen by those who were either worthy of their position or exceptionally clever. Anyone who could not see the clothes, they said, would be exposed as unfit for their role or just plain stupid. The emperor, always eager to outshine everyone else, was immediately intrigued. He decided that he must have these extraordinary clothes for himself. So, he ordered his most trusted ministers to visit the swindlers and report on their progress. The ministers, who were keen to demonstrate their own intelligence, went to the swindlers' workshop. To their surprise, they saw nothing on the looms. The swindlers were pretending to weave with empty spools and were holding up empty fabric for display. However, not wanting to appear foolish or unfit for their positions, the ministers praised the non-existent fabric extravagantly. They complimented the colors, which they claimed were magnificent and changing with the light, and the texture, which they described as feeling like the softest silk. The ministers returned to the emperor with glowing reports. They told him that the clothes were indeed the most beautiful they had ever seen. The emperor, who was eager to see the garments himself, visited the swindler's workshop. He looked at the empty looms and saw nothing but continued to praise the fabric. He was too proud to admit that he couldn't see it. The emperor's excitement grew as he imagined himself wearing the exquisite clothes. He couldn't wait to flaunt them to his subjects and show off his new attire. Little did he know, the swindlers were laughing behind his back, knowing that they had tricked him and his ministers into believing in their invisible creation. The arrival of the swindlers. The emperor was delighted to hear about the arrival of two renowned weavers who promised to create the most exquisite clothes imaginable. Their reputation for crafting unparalleled garments had reached the palace, and the emperor, always eager to showcase the latest fashion, was thrilled by the prospect. The swindlers arrived in the city with much fanfare. They dressed in the most elaborate outfits, making a grand entrance that caught everyone's attention. Their clothes were richly adorned with sparkling gems and intricate designs, which made them appear both sophisticated and impressive. The townspeople buzzed with excitement, eager to see the new weavers and their promised creations. The swindlers were greeted warmly at the palace. They presented themselves with great flair, claiming they were masters of an extraordinary craft. They spoke of their magical fabrics that could reveal the true worth and wisdom of those who wore them. According to them, only the most intelligent and worthy individuals would be able to see and appreciate the beauty of these garments, while those who were foolish or unfit would see nothing at all. The emperor, intrigued by this notion, was eager to see the results. He could hardly wait to have such magnificent clothes that would not only showcase his grandeur, but also reveal his own superior wisdom. He immediately arranged for a substantial amount of gold and silk to be provided to the swindlers so they could begin their work. The swindlers set up their workshop in a lavishly decorated room. They appeared to work diligently at their looms, but to anyone who looked, there was nothing visible on the looms. They spoke constantly about the progress they were making, describing the colors and patterns of the fabric in glowing terms. Despite the fact that there was nothing on the looms, the emperor's curiosity grew each day. He visited the workshop frequently, eager to see the progress. Each time, he was met with the same sight: the swindlers moving their hands as if weaving, but nothing was actually being produced. The emperor was unsure if he should admit that he could see nothing. He was afraid of being seen as unfit or foolish. The ministers who accompanied him were also hesitant, fearing they might be considered unworthy if they admitted they could not see the fabric either. They all kept their concerns to themselves and praised the swindler's work, even though there was nothing to see. As the days passed, the excitement in the palace and the city grew. The anticipation for the grand unveiling of the emperor's new clothes was building, but none of the officials or the emperor himself were willing to admit that they could see nothing at all. The emperor's inspection. The emperor was determined to experience the full effect of his new clothes. After all the fuss about the splendid attire, he was eager to see for himself how truly remarkable it was. He had been told that his new clothes would look even more impressive in a formal setting, and he was eager to see if the claims were true. The emperor had scheduled a private inspection of his new clothes. The swindlers had prepared a special room in the palace, adorned with mirrors and soft lighting to showcase their masterpieces. The emperor walked into the room, his heart filled with anticipation. He expected to be greeted by the breathtaking sight of his new clothes and could hardly wait to see them in detail. As he entered the room, the swindlers were waiting with beaming smiles, their faces filled with fake enthusiasm. They continued to praise the clothes, making grand gestures as they described how the fabric shimmered and changed colors. "The emperor's new clothes are indeed a marvel," one of them said. "The finest garments ever created. The colors are designed to complement the emperor's noble stature." The emperor, with great excitement, looked into the large mirrors, but to his dismay, he saw nothing but his own bare self. He looked from one angle to another, turning and twisting, trying to find the invisible clothes. The swindlers continued to talk about the beauty of the garments, but their words began to sound hollow. The emperor's excitement began to wane as he realized he saw nothing at all. He tried to convince himself that the clothes were indeed spectacular, as the swindlers had described. He focused on the mirror, trying to see the elusive fabric that everyone was raving about. He even started to admire the invisible patterns and colors they spoke of, hoping that by pretending to be impressed, he would eventually see them. But despite his efforts, the truth was undeniable. There were no clothes. The swindlers continued their charade, and the emperor, trying to maintain his dignity, played along. He spoke about how pleased he was with the garments and how they perfectly suited his royal stature. He complimented the swindlers, who beamed with satisfaction, taking his praise as a sign of their success. When the inspection was over, the emperor had to leave the room, still pretending to be fully dressed in his non-existent attire. He had been assured that the clothes would be finished and ready for the grand parade, so he reluctantly accepted this charade, hoping that the public display might somehow justify the entire affair. As he walked back to his chambers, he reflected on the situation. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the growing realization that he had been deceived. The swindlers had made a fool out of him, and despite his best efforts to maintain the illusion, he could not escape the feeling of being duped. The emperor's inspection had exposed a glaring truth. He had been swindled. Yet, he was trapped by his own pride and the fear of admitting his mistake. He had to keep up appearances, even if it meant continuing the pretense of wearing clothes that didn't exist. The emperor left the inspection room with a heavy heart, knowing deep down that the truth would soon come to light. But for now, he was determined to uphold the illusion for as long as he could, convinced that it was the only way to save face and preserve his royal dignity. The Emperor's Parade. The day of the Grand Parade had finally arrived. The entire city was abuzz with excitement as the people prepared to witness the Emperor's grand display of his new, magnificent clothes. The streets were lined with eager citizens, all eagerly waiting to catch a glimpse of the Emperor's latest fashion. The Emperor, dressed in his invisible clothes, stood in front of a mirror, still trying to convince himself of their beauty. His courtiers, who had all been thoroughly convinced by the swindler's clever ruse, applauded and praised his attire with exaggerated enthusiasm. They made grand gestures as if they could see the exquisite garments that weren't there. The Emperor walked through the palace corridors, surrounded by his most trusted advisors and officials. They all acted as if they could see the non-existent clothes, their faces full of admiration. Some even nodded in agreement, echoing the praises they had heard from others. The Emperor could feel their eyes on him, and he could hear their gasps of amazement as he walked by. As he reached the Grand Parade route, the crowd's cheer grew louder. The streets were filled with people from all walks of life, all eager to see their emperor in his new attire. The parade had been meticulously planned with musicians, dancers, and performers all dressed in their finest clothes, creating a festive atmosphere. The emperor's carriage was adorned with flowers and ribbons, making it look even more splendid against the backdrop of the cheering crowd. The emperor stepped into the carriage, still trying to maintain his composure. He could feel the warmth of the sun and the cool breeze as he rode along the parade route. The crowd's excitement was palpable, and their cheers filled the air. The emperor waved and smiled, his face a mask of confidence. He had to maintain the illusion, no matter how uncomfortable or absurd it felt. As the carriage moved along, the emperor's thoughts were a whirlwind of anxiety. He had hoped that the grandeur of the parade would somehow make the invisible clothes seem real. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had been deceived, and his pride was now on display for the entire city to see. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread as he imagined how the crowd might react when the truth finally came out. The parade route was long, and the emperor had to endure it from start to finish. He tried to focus on the enthusiastic cheers and the spectacle of the festivities, but his mind kept drifting back to the reality of his situation. He knew that the longer he continued to parade around in his non-existent clothes, the more difficult it would be to admit the truth. As the parade progressed, the emperor started to notice that some of the spectators were whispering and pointing. Their excited chatter had turned into murmurs of confusion. The emperor couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but their expressions told a story of growing doubt. It was clear that not everyone was convinced by the emperor's performance. Despite the growing discomfort, the emperor kept his composure, determined to see the parade through to the end. He had to maintain his dignity and uphold the illusion, even as he felt the weight of the deception bearing down on him. He couldn't let the crowd see his inner turmoil. As the parade drew to a close, the emperor returned to the palace, exhausted and anxious. The cheers of the crowd had faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. The emperor knew that he couldn't continue the charade forever. The truth was bound to come out, and he would have to face the consequences of his vanity and pride. Back at the palace, the courtiers and advisors congratulated the emperor on the success of the parade. They continued to praise his clothes, but their words seemed hollow. The emperor could no longer ignore the growing realization that he had been a victim of a clever trick. The swindlers had exploited his vanity, and now he was left with nothing but a false sense of grandeur. The emperor retired to his chambers, feeling the weight of his deception more heavily than ever. He had hoped that the parade would somehow validate the invisible clothes, but instead, it had only highlighted the absurdity of the situation. The reality of his predicament was sinking in, and he knew that he would have to face the truth sooner or later. As he lay in bed, the emperor couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment and regret. The parade had been a grand spectacle, but it had been built on a foundation of deception. He had been duped, and now he had to come to terms with the consequences of his pride. The emperor's parade had been a public display of his vanity, and the truth was waiting just around the corner. The reveal. As the emperor paraded through the city, the atmosphere was filled with excitement and anticipation. But amidst the cheering crowd and the vibrant display, a sense of unease began to grow. The longer the parade continued, the more evident it became that something was amiss. The emperor's procession wound through the streets, and as he approached the central square, the murmurs among the spectators grew louder. The crowd, initially enthusiastic, began to exchange puzzled glances. Some of the children, who had been eagerly watching the parade, started to point and whisper among themselves. Their innocent curiosity soon spread to the adults. In the midst of this, a young child, standing at the edge of the crowd, broke the silence. With a mixture of awe and confusion, the child's voice rang out, "But he isn't wearing anything at all." The words were simple but powerful, and they cut through the noise of the parade like a knife. At first, there was silence. The crowd seemed to freeze, unsure if they had heard correctly. The emperor, perched high in his carriage, felt a wave of panic. He glanced around, trying to gauge the reactions of those around him. The once exuberant cheers turned into a collective gasp of realization. The truth was out. The courtiers and officials who had been praising the emperor's clothes were now visibly uncomfortable. Their previous admiration had been nothing but a facade. They exchanged uneasy glances and tried to maintain their composure, but it was clear that the illusion had shattered. The emperor's pride had led him to be deceived, and now he was left with nothing but a false sense of grandeur. The emperor left the inspection room with a heavy heart, knowing deep down that the truth would soon come to light. But for now, he was determined to uphold the illusion for as long as he could, convinced that it was the only way to save face and preserve his royal dignity. Realizing that the truth was now inescapable, the emperor felt a deep sense of shame. He had been a victim of his own vanity, and the public spectacle had only highlighted his folly. The parade, intended to display his grandeur, had become a display of his deception. In that moment, the emperor had to confront the harsh reality. The invisible clothes were nothing more than a clever trick. The child's innocent comment had stripped away the pretense, leaving the emperor exposed and vulnerable. As he made his way back to the palace, he knew that the impact of the reveal would be long-lasting. The lesson had been learned, and the emperor's pride had been humbled.